Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Today, we are proud to launch our latest report, Understanding Biodiversity. It is co-created with biodiversity expert Globalbalance, and it explains key aspects of biodiversity and explores how luxury businesses can take action today. In today's webinar, Positive Luxury's co-founder and CEO, Diana Verde Nieto, is joined by Mark Gough, CEO of the Capitals Coalition, Kristin Rechberger, CEO of Dynamic Planet, and Annelisa Grigg, Director and Sustainability Advisor at Globalbalance. This webinar will be 45 minutes, including 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So please submit your questions anytime during the webinar in the Q&A tab, and the speakers will answer them at the end. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you very much, Kristin, Mark, Mark and Annelisa, to joining us today. It's a real privilege to be with you all. And we know that we are on an inflection point to transform our world. We ought to build a genuine, sustainable society and obviously sustainable economies away from fossil fuel. That was probably the loudest and clearest message that we basically received at TED last week. It is only taking collective action, bold collective action, that we will actually solve the climate crisis. And we definitely need to make sure that we look after our planet and our natural world. It's a real pleasure to share this floor with you all and deep dive into the conversation. So I'd like to start with Kristin. And with some optimism on this, because, I know that you are very involved in a campaign which is 30 by 30, which is about protecting 30% of our world by 2030. Can you tell us a little bit more about 30 by 30?
So thank you for having me, Diana, and wonderful to be back with Positive Luxury. 30 by 30 is a campaign. It's a high-level action coalition with high-level government representatives of over 80 countries now supporting this campaign of 30% of the planet protected by 2030. And we have a long way to go to get there. Some of you may know that only about 8% of the ocean's protected, about 17% of the land. But we know that there's this big gap between what nature is really good at doing, which is, the biodiversity has homes and jobs and things that they do for us. We live off their energy, and the more we deplete it, the worse it is for us, as exhibited by COVID-19 and all the duress of the last couple of years. So there's this big gap between nature and how much has been eroded and sustainable consumption and production. And growing the 30% by 2030 is one big goal. And I hope we can talk today too more about how to better manage the other 70% for sustainable consumption and production. And we need to close gaps on both sides.
Thank you very much. And I guess the valid question is for you, Annelisa. So can you tell us a little bit more about what does biodiversity encompass, and what is the difference between biodiversity and nature?
Sure, and thanks for having me also. So I think there's a lot of different terms that are used in relation to biodiversity. People are talking about nature, they're talking about nature positive business, nature positive economy, they're talking about natural capital and ecosystem services, and really understanding how they all fit together is really important. So biodiversity is not quite the same thing as nature. So let's start with nature. So nature are all the processes, the things on the planet that we don't necessarily create. So that includes mountains, it includes water, and it includes biodiversity as well. Natural capital are the assets on which society are dependent. So they're the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources on which society and indeed business are dependent. Now, components of natural capital, so natural capital assets, species and habitats, are also components of biodiversity, but they're not the same thing. So biodiversity itself is, in simplest terms, the variety of life on Earth. And it's that very variety that acts almost as an insurance policy for us. So it ensures that we have access to these natural capital assets into the future. It ensures they maintain their resilience, and that we can derive what's called ecosystem services, so services from nature on which we rely. So an example, maybe to pull it all together, I always like to use the example of pollination. So an example of an ecosystem service is pollination. So we get use the services from bees, from midges and so on to pollinate crops that give us crops in the right quantity and quality. So the midge and the cocoa plant, I think, is a really good example here. So your biodiversity is the variety of different pollinators, and indeed the variety of habitats on which those pollinators are dependent. And that's if you only had one midge or one type of midge, in this world where we're facing climate change and that midge went extinct, then you'd lose the ability to pollinate cocoa plants in some parts of the world, and then you'd lose chocolate. So for me, that's a massive loss, a slightly flippant example of a loss of a significant service to mankind, or personkind, I should say. But it shows you just the flow of services that we get from the natural world, and the really important role that the variety of life on Earth plays in delivering those services on which we're dependent.
Thank you. And if you have not heard anything like this, we ought to protect our biodiversity and our natural world, just not to lose chocolate. So if that's the only thing you take away from this, that is okay. On a serious note, thank you very much, Annelisa. So, Mark, I mean, you have Capitals Coalition works with an incredible myriad of experts across many areas of biodiversity and ecosystem management. So what is the reputational risk of not thinking about biodiversity, and how are nature and biodiversity going to be integrated into ESG metrics, which is environmental social governance matrix?
Thank you kindly for inviting me here today. So I think the thing about reputational risk is when we first started looking at this topic back with the economics of the environment and biodiversity, the scientific reports, etc., most of the people behind that work were expecting this to be driven by reputational risk. But actually, it's been driven by those dependencies that Annelisa was talking about just there. It's actually driven by our reliance upon nature that is actually making businesses to stand up. But reputational risk is changing now. And if you look at the G7 announcements that came out earlier this year, where it was very clear that the economics of nature was one of the calls from the finance departments of those countries, that they look at where the other statements are coming out were all around this. If you look at nature positive, this new global agenda that we're looking at, which is looking across climate change, nature positive, also climate neutral, nature positive, and inequity as well. When you look at that, that has to have an understanding and a reputational risk associated with it as well. So this is rising up the agenda. I think the other thing, there are lots of risks associated here, is about the way that we're seeing the building in of these requirements into disclosure standards for business. And I can say a little bit more about that in a moment, but also into our understanding of the way that business works. So if we go back to the Business Roundtable last 2 years ago now, when they started talking about purpose, you can see that this is now starting to come through, maybe not as a legal requirement, but definitely more as a social norm in the way that you would do it. So it is getting to the point, particularly at Davos coming up in January, where you can guarantee if you meet a CEO there and you mention these sort of issues to them, they will have a response to you. Now, a few years ago, they wouldn't have done. Now they will have a response to you. In the financial sector, a couple of years ago, I was trying to roll out this work in Hong Kong. I was talking to empty rooms. No one was interested. Funnily enough, now I can't get into the room because almost every financial institution is starting to think about it. So there is a reputational risk there. On the ESG side, or how do we build this into the standards of how we're doing things? I think the first thing is that what we've been doing on capitals does go beyond what ESG is doing. So ESG is very much looking about the environmental, social, and governance. It's not looking at those impacts and the dependencies. So we've got to make sure that we're understanding the context of what we're doing, not just the numbers. We can't just count the number of pollinators that Annelisa was talking about, 1,000 pollinators. We've got to know what it is that they're actually doing. We've got to know the impact that they're having. And that is really important to bring in. We are, though, at the moment, in a project we're doing with Annelisa and with UNEP, WCMC, and various other people, we are at the moment bringing together all the metrics around biodiversity, all the different projects that are coming together through a project called Align. And that Align project is funded by the European Commission and is actually now starting to develop standardized recommendations for standardization of what we might do. So how can we bring that work that's going on in all these different pockets, which is very confusing to many people, into a standardized approach? So that is ongoing. We will be coming out with some materials on that for you to consult on quite soon. So 2 messages from this are definitely top level, definitely reputational risk is now coming. And also the standardization of how you might approach this is coming as well. If you're not taking account of all of those things, you will be left behind.
Thank you. And that counts very strong, especially if you work in areas like beauty or premium drinks. And of course, fashion. Biodiversity is absolutely key in order to keep those raw materials, alive. I mean, Kristin, you have been very much involved in part of making those standards. So for where you sit, how are nature and biodiversity going to be integrated into the standards?
Is this to me, Deanna? Thank you. Yeah, so there's, as Mark was saying, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of different actors coming together to really define metrics in a better, smarter way. Making sure they're science-based and impact-based is really important. And, the finance world is moving towards ESG, but to get there, companies and cities are really needing to focus on the science-based metrics to really start incorporating and accounting in their operations. So biodiversity is finally getting some attention in the same way that water and carbon has gained traction over time. But there's a lot of work to do. A lot of it needs really great layering of place-based data and looking at patterns across this data so that you can start looking at trends. And one of the exciting things is that in this age of technology where you can do lots of great monitoring, including by satellite, so you can see what's reforested or deforested and things like that, you can tie a lot of things to these metrics, including, like Mark said, social, which is as important as the ecological, and really start seeing some of these things and how maybe conservation can have the same transparency of what's going on as, say, a commodities trader. There's no reason we can't. So we're trying to use as much as we can to pile on data, technology, AI, and other pieces. But again, as Mark said, understanding what that all means and really holistically looking at a system is one of the most important parts of this work.
Absolutely. And I mean, I want to go back to where we started into our conversation, which is 30 by 30 and Dynamic Planet and the National Geographic and Rick Salas, that I know you work very closely with, have done amazing work on oceans. And you guys have been championing, as well with the World Economic Forum and many other stakeholders, about this 30 by 30 kind of initiative. So do you think that we will get there? What do we need to do collectively in order to get there?
Well, we know how to get there, which is great. We have some amazing mapping on the land and in the sea to know it's actually really important which 30% to help protect and make sure that local people are doing that protection. The most important thing we need now is funding to really jumpstart this transition. We find that there's great demand for transitioning the market from extraction to regeneration, but nobody really wants to pay for it. And so we know that 30 by 30, we need about $160 billion a year, which sounds like a lot, but it's a speck of what we, as Annelisa said, this is our life support system. So we need to be reinvesting in that. And when you think about supply and demand, again, there's that 30% that's the insurance policy, as she said, that thing that keeps everything running properly at the base of our wedding cake. When you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals sitting on first the biosphere, which is, the land and ocean and climate security, and then our societies and economies sit on that. There we go. That's it, Mark. If something happens to our foundation, what happens to everything on top? Well, we've seen that in the last couple of years, right? So 30 by 30 is about reinvesting in everything that we've been consuming since humans were around. We've taken more than we've given back. It's really that simple. So really, we want to reinvest in helping nature do what it does best, which is, again, it has all these functions that have evolved for billions of years Nature knows much better how to heal itself than we do. And so if we give it time to heal, as we see in the ocean, it's amazing how much regenerative property there is in the ocean. Talk about value creation. We talk about it for companies. The ocean, if you just let it heal, within 5 years, miraculously regenerates itself. We help build national parks in the sea. We're inside the parks because the fish come back, tourism comes back, and communities can benefit from that. And there's also spillover of these fish outside the reserves where you have much more sustainable fisheries. So the ocean's incredibly regenerative. On the land, it's harder. There's a lot more barriers and competition, but we also know that it has amazing regenerative properties. And we need this foundation to be solid to move forward, because we actually need half the planet in natural state. So 30% by 2030 is actually just a milestone to 50 by 2050. And counterintuitively, the more people we have on the planet, the more nature we need to support those people, not less nature. We actually need more.
Yeah, and we cannot eat money, so we need to definitely invest in nature. So I'd like to go to Mark, because this is it's a topic that is actually quite close to my heart. In terms of social, because biodiversity is a social issue. Can you unpack a little bit more about that? Why is it biodiversity a social issue?
So we first started as the Natural Capital Coalition, taking that great scientific opus of work and trying to convert that into a language which was accessible for application. We quite quickly realized, with all of the companies that started applying this, that actually they got to a point where they had to understand the social, the human capital as well. So the reason why we're now the Capitals Coalition is because it was driven by the businesses as they were trying to address biodiversity and natural capital. They realized they had to bring in social. So this is coming directly from businesses who have been trying to grapple with this. A good example of this, thinking about oceans again, which is something very close to my heart as well. In oceans plastic, it sounds like an environmental problem. But when we look at it, the reason why the plastic ends up in the oceans is a social issue. It's actually the way that we treat people. It's the way that we treat the people that pick up our trash and our waste. It's the slavery that is going on still in the shipping industry that actually means that those plastics end up in the ocean in the first place. We could solve the plastic problem, we could make it break down or whatever, but it would still end up going there if we don't deal with the social issues. So environmental problem, social issues. And what we found, and when we've been looking at this, you can do a natural capital assessment and understand the biodiversity elements and what you're trying to, those stocks that Annelisa was talking about. You can do a social one or a human one. We're doing a lot of great work on living wage at the moment. And how do we pay a living wage? Which is a fascinating topic. I haven't met a CEO yet, and when you're talking to them heart to heart, they say it doesn't think they should. They believe they should be paying the right wages for people. The problem is when they get into the boardroom and the CFO is sitting there, they say, well, I'm not going to increase my costs. Why would I increase my costs? And it's because the way that we account for a living wage, our people, we put it down as a cost on our accounts. If we stopped putting it down as a cost, and like we did with oil and gas exploration, we started saying we can amortize it. It's an investment over a period of 5-10 years. Then what would that do to the way that we looked at the way that we pay for people? And I think that we've got to, if you do these studies independently, you'll get one result. If you add them together, you get a different result. But really they're integrated. And every time you look at one factor, it will affect the others that are going on, which is why we have to have an integrated approach to this. Biodiversity teaches us we're in a system, we're all working in a system, and yet we seem to try and find solutions which are siloed. That's not going to work. We've got to do it in the system. And apparel is particularly important for this. It's one of those nexus points, the food sector and apparel, where all of these things come together. You've got the produced capital, you've got the land, the natural capital, the essential bits of biodiversity for the cotton and all those other things that you're going to grow, and you've got the people. And a lot of those people that are involved are smallholder farmers. They're people on a local, low income. They're local people within communities that are working to do this. If we don't bring them into this conversation, if we invest in the people, there's plenty of studies in this, you can have significant improvements in biodiversity. Invest in the women in Africa and make sure that they're getting the right money. We've seen those improvements in the local environment when you make sure the money's going to the right people in the right way and you're giving them training and education. You can see those improvements happen in biodiversity. So these things are interconnected. We can't separate them.
Absolutely. And I asked you guys before a question, which was, and let's not go into this if you think that COP is going to be a success or failure, but we really need to think about this, like you said, systemically, and the global North needs to think about what is the impact on the global South. And like you said, Mark, 82% of all our impacts across are in the global South. And maybe there is a business case that instead of talking about purpose, we act on purpose. And actually what we do is businesses start investment in helping the global South to develop sustainably, and that is social and environmental. That would be possibly the best outcome from the public sector and the private sector to come together with COP. Let's see if it happens. Hopefully it will happen, but otherwise, hopefully there's a lot of people in the private sector listening to this that can hear that ambition. Let's go back to Annelisa, because you start talking about, you have quite a lot of data about the business case for biodiversity when we talk about supply chains and raw materials and how important this is. So can you unpack a little bit of that?
Sure. I think Mark sort of started to set this out, really, that you have a series of risks really that are beginning to crystallize, both around impacts of different sectors on biodiversity, but perhaps more importantly on their dependency. So we started the conversation talking about reputational risk. If you look at impacts, there tends to be a focus on reputational risk, and that then becomes almost a nice to have, and it's quite hard to see how that links to the bottom line. But when you start thinking about how a company or a supply chain is dependent on ecosystem services, that becomes a very different conversation that then hits to operational risk. It can hit profit margins, it can impact yield, quantity and quality. And that then starts moving you towards a very different conversation, and one that you can have with the financial people in the world. So I'm an accountant myself. I started off as an ecologist, but then moved to qualify as an accountant. So I've spent many years trying to articulate the business case in the language of the accountants around biodiversity. And maybe just to take a few examples to bring it to life a little bit. So if you look at, so let's take jewelry and the sourcing of precious metals. So we know that there is significant overlap between mine sites and important areas for biodiversity, both legally protected and those that have been designated by environmental groups as important. So if you're not aware of where you're sourcing your materials from, there's a risk that they may be impacting on important areas of biodiversity, and that can lead to significant campaigns that can in turn lead to, in some cases, complete having to move away from that particular supply chain. So there have been mining and oil and gas operations that have either been significantly delayed or shut down as a result of things like that. When you look at the dependency side, and we've already talked about pollination, but we've got materials that are being sourced into the luxury goods sector that are very fundamentally dependent on the natural world, ranging from corals to leathers to fiber, more generally. So we have just that very physical kind of relationship between nature that's causing a risk, and indeed it's articulated increasingly as physical risk. But we also have what's called transition risk, which is really the sort of social norms and the interests that are coming through from consumers. So increasingly the sort of new generation of consumers are aware and concerned about this issue and wanting to see labels on products that show the provenance of them. We're also seeing a growth of interest in the finance sector, as I think Mark suggested. So just in the last few weeks, there was a statement from over 78 finance institutions calling for stronger policy from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the sort of overarching policy framework for biodiversity, and is currently being renegotiated. And they want stronger policy, because it's not sufficient to move things forward. So you've got a much more informed finance sector. They're actually pledging to measure and monitor the impact of their investments, which will include companies, I'm sure, who are on the line and beginning to develop tools and approaches that enable them to do that. That's a little way off, but I've never seen so much interest in this topic, and I've been working on it for 15, 20 years now. So it's really exciting times. And I think the business case is becoming much, much, much stronger, particularly then when you also look at systemic risk. So COVID-19, it's thought had its origins in the wildlife trade markets in China. Now we know what ripples that's had around the world. I guess our trouble or our challenge is that nature is very much our life support system, but as we all know from our own health, until our health sort of crumbles and falls over, we're still going to be eating that piece of chocolate or having that glass of wine, or not necessarily behaving in the most healthy manner. So it almost takes a crisis for us to be able to act, and that crisis, as we know, is coming down the line.
Absolutely, but I really hope that I think we are in the crisis. We are in the midst of this crisis, just that we are like frogs in boiling water. We are not realizing that we are being boiled. So we need to act fast. And before we close down, because I can't believe it's almost time, I'd like to go really quickly to you, Kristin, because you're very passionate about the intersection between supply chain and biodiversity as a social issue. So can you speak a little bit more about that from a perhaps high-level perspective?
Thank you. Basically, I think we all talk about biodiversity, and those of us who've been working in conservation for our careers talk about the nature side, but the social side, the human side is very, very interlinked. And we're seeing in our work that we have to show the social benefits as much as the nature benefits. And as Mark knows, his organization actually includes all of that social capital metrics along with the natural capital metrics. So there's a lot of meshing going on between the impact and how we can measure the social returns on these things too. And just to remind everybody that biodiversity is as much of a development and economic and social and moral issue as an environmental issue. As a development issue, obviously biodiversity is essentially for the quality of life, food, clean water, energy, medicine, secure livelihoods, again, regulating the climate, air quality, fresh water quality, these things that are the underpinning of our lives. But it's also an economic and social issue, and then a moral and equity issue. And what we mean by that is, for example, when we're working at the base of these supply chains, and let's take the oceans again, we know that when, ironically, more stakeholders come in and work together on a holistic system to manage the ocean, more people benefit. Traditionally, it's been kind of just oil or just fishing in the extraction industries that have benefited at the cost of all of us. But if we can bring in more stakeholders, including the communities that obviously live there and could be benefiting more locally from those resources, they can steward them in the long term. And some of our best biodiversity managers are Indigenous peoples and people on the ground working around the world. They are the suppliers. They're the source. There are essential workers, if you will, that are really helping the whole supply chain upstream. And the more that the benefits can stay local, the more I think we have a chance of long-term success. And a lot of that has come to a fore during this COVID crisis, again, in the United States, or this Black Lives Matter, all the movements around the world for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know that when biodiversity is managed well locally with communities and localized and looked at holistically, then that really shifts supply chain to a much more sustainable, equitable value chain all the way up to those of us that are consuming on the demand side.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to stay with you, and I will ask this question to you all. I mean, what advice would you give companies to start looking at how can they internalize their supply chain and understand their impact on the natural world? And that's to you, Kristin, first.
I think your report's a great place to start, asking those initial questions and thinking about our own chain from what we take to where it goes.
Thank you. Annelisa, what is your take on this?
So I think obviously the report is a good starting point. I think we need to be asking our questions. Our question, how can we use the creativity of the luxury goods industry to create change? Because we have such a force of influence through consumers that isn't open to many other sectors. So I think I'm I'm a great one in believing in the innovation of the private sector here. And I think we need to bring that innovative power to play here to try and influence markets, to try and narrow down the funding gap and start channeling the funding that's needed into the conservation of the environment, not necessarily in protected areas, but making sure that our agricultural landscapes are maintained in such a way that are really that delivers a benefit for biodiversity. So start chunking down your supply chains. So say, which are my major supply chains? What's the biggest value? Where do I have the most influence? And which are the ones that potentially have the greatest impact and dependence on biodiversity? And there's tools out there to do that, and that's within the briefing paper that we did together, at least some of them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Annelisa. And I mean, the same question to you, Mark, before we go into the Q&As.
So within the report that you'll see that Annelisa has been doing, this, I can take all these things off my wall today, that's what you're trying to do. So this framework here, the Natural Capital Protocol, takes you through a very logical 9 steps, all the actions you would need to take, 4 stages to actually start to thinking about this problem. What we've then been able to do, and that's what it looks like if you want to get a copy of it. That's a very broad framework. That's an internationally accepted, brings together all of the different people that have worked on it. What we've then done, in fact, with UNEP WCMC, and Annelisa helped us on this as well, was we developed specific biodiversity guidance and a navigation tool to take you through that. We've also worked very closely with particular sectors, and the luxury goods sector and apparel have been one of the prominent ones within that. So we've got lots of people within that sector that are already working on this with us. So there's a community there. We've got a community site. And then there's the Align project that's obviously coming through now that will take you even to that next stage. One more final thing, we've been working with We Value Nature, which was a campaign we set up last 3 years, which actually is dedicated to help people starting on this journey. So it literally has a help desk. You can phone them up and they can start talking you through how you might go about understanding your impacts and dependencies in this area. And it can help to support you through that process, find the technical providers, make sure you've got the right resources and direct you through it. And to be honest, that's what the coalition is the resource to be able to help you to answer that question that you've just posed.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to the Q&A, and thank you very much, Kristin and Annelisa and Mark, for your time on doing this. I will start with the easy ones. Matthew Kilgary, it's very nice to see you, or think that I see you. We can definitely send you the cake that Mark showed.
I've already done it, actually. I've already sent the link in the answer.
Done. So that is a easy one to do. How much funding there are currently for 30 by 30? That's probably Kristin.
Thank you, Charlie. There is a resource. The process is a political process with the UN, with the Convention on Biodiversity, which is hosted by China and will be finalized next year. There have been, as I mentioned in the beginning, more and more governments signing on to 30 by 30, which is really exciting. With those commitments, the big questions are where should protection happen and how much will it cost? And some governments have come forward already, and more will be coming forward with their commitments. For example, last year, Canada committed over $3 billion in 30 by 30. So there's a resource mobilization work stream, and I can send you some of the details of that if you'd like to get in touch. And there's the public financing. We also need private financing. As Annelisa said, the private sector is critically important to this movement. And it's not just about the governments, as there's a lot of public disappointment in government action and government speed. And a lot of the private sector can move much quicker. And the coalitions of private sectors are incredible because they can actually demand things of government as a whole sector, including for 30 by 30. So what we're seeing is some of the sectors that are very reliant on nature, including pharmaceuticals, tourism, luxury brands, and others, are starting to really come together and think about their own resource mobilization for 30 by 30. And because ultimately it will support their own operations and long-term business as well. So we need as much public as private sector support. And I can send more details on resource mobilization.
Thank you very much. I don't know who would like to take this question. What is your take on regenerative fashion?
It's a good question. We're finding, I mean, maybe generally, we're finding most of our conversations now, where they were maybe talking about risks or they started talking about opportunities, now regenerative seems to be the phrase that's really bringing people together. So I think no matter where we are, it's going to be something that will convene and bring people into the conversation. There is a group setting up at the moment to really define what we mean by it, because I think there's still quite a lot of, as Annelisa started off with definitions on what biodiversity was, what natural capital is, I think we need to be clear about what regenerative means in this sense. So I think it was definitely something to hold in mind when you're engaging. It would be something that would be a calling card to engage with and get people together. But we really need to start working out really what that means in a day-to-day practice. And I think that's exciting new frontier to try and work through, but we don't know yet, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean,
Would you agree, Annelisa? Would you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I had a similar conversation about regenerative agriculture a few weeks ago, and that we're just getting to the point of having clear definitions for that. I think we're suffering a little bit from multiple term overload in this space. But at the same time, if that term then engages a new constituency, then that's what's needed to cascade the concepts. As long as the overall message of preventing the loss of nature it is within that, then that's great.
Absolutely, but we need to be aware of greenwashing, because everything is regenerative. Even there is regenerative croissants at the moment. So let's make sure that the world doesn't turn from sustainability to regenerative. So that's my cynical side of it. How do you recommend convincing upper management in the value of biodiversity? I don't know who would like to take that.
I think that. Go on, Annelisa.
No, I think the business case is increasingly clear now. So there is material that we can draw from to understand exactly how fundamentally connected the business is that you're involved in to the natural world. So I think there's a combination of doing the homework to be able to articulate that business case. And what I've seen work in the past is bringing together senior experts to engage with senior management within companies. That has worked to provide the ammunition that you need to create action.
I have a slightly perverse response to this. I worked in business for about 20 years before I started doing this. And I was only ever asked for a business case after the decision had been made. So you never write a business case. You never. If I wish it was, Annelisa, that we could put forward all of the evidence and convince people, but I've never found that to work. What happens is the CEO goes out for dinner on a Sunday night with some friends, and then they come back to you and they say, pollinators. It's all got to be about pollinators. And then all of a sudden your strategy changes. So make sure when you're in business, you've got that content, you can back it up. You've got that information to come through straight away and to give the case for it. But you need to get the CEO and the senior management to have dinner with someone. And that would be the best thing you could do. Tap on the shoulder, go out for dinner, go to a nice restaurant, talk about biodiversity, wear some nice clothes, all of that. That's where we're going to get the traction. It will be on a personal level, I think.
Wear some nice clothes. I think a few scientific will probably help as well.
Well, the science is needed, but I do think that we need to be able to have that as a backup.
I think this is very valid, though. It's about psychology, it's about personalities, and it's about creating a movement and a change. And yes, all the best science in the world will only get you so far. We need to ignite people's passion to create action.
Absolutely. Listen to Greta otherwise as well. Just sending your CEO a lot of links to Greta's speeches. And if that doesn't work, just the Blue Planet will do the job. Mark, big favor. Could you please send a link on the chat for the cake visuals so everybody can have it?
I thought I'd already done that, but I'll do it again. I'll make sure I do it again.
Thank you very much. A question, I don't know who would like to take this question. What one question should an investor ask of their company's portfolio?
So this is a really interesting one. I'll give it a go. So for me, it's how is your company helping us deliver a nature positive world? So that I think is the key thing. So it's about innovation, it's about transition. It's not about doing existing business and following existing business models and doing less harm. It's about how do you create this step change and this leap.
Thank you. This is from Tanya. Is there a global agreed list of the top 10 to 20 species that are suffering most severely from a degradation in biodiversity? So have biodiversity efforts been prioritized to move from extinction to rebuild biodiversity? This is a Kristin question, probably.
Yeah, I can give it a go as well.
So this one's the species at most risk are listed in the Iucn Red List, and it's there's a structure of which ones are the most endangered. That's the Iucn Red List, and you can look that up. There was a recent article just 2 weeks ago around how many species actually are truly extinct now, and I think I can try to find that quickly and post it. But basically, we're in the middle of this biodiversity crisis. There is real extinction and loss. There's also a cool project that Joel Sartori does from National Geographic called Photo Arc, and he's documenting those Iucn Red List creatures. And obviously, all of these pieces of life are part of the web of life from our past that we want to take through our future. And it's kind of like getting on a plane. And if it's missing some parts and you don't know which parts are missing, would you still get on the plane? That's kind of what's happening with biodiversity loss right now in our planet. And what we want to do is keep that fabric as interwoven as possible so that we can continue to live off of it as richly as we have in previous generations for future generations. So the Iucn Red List is a good place to go for exact species and where they are in the spectrum of starting to go extinct.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course.
Yeah, if I could just add, but I think the point is that we need to go beyond charismatic, well, they're not just charismatic, there's some uncharismatic species on the Red List as well, but beyond the Red List, there are also other prioritization schemes, such as protected areas, not key biodiversity areas, or priority sites, I should say. So as well as looking at species, we need to look at priority ecosystems, priority habitats, and be aware and mindful of those as well.
Thank you. I mean, and we are pretty much reached the time for this webinar today. So I just want to thank you very, very much, Mark and Melissa and Kristin, for taking the time. And let's make sure that the biodiversity revolution have the same pace that the sustainability revolution, which, fingers crossed, will have the speed of the digital revolution and the transformative scale that the industrial revolution had, but without the emissions, let's say. So I like to end in a positive note. So I want to thank you all, and I'll hand it over to Claudia.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Mark, Kristin, Annelisa. In the chat, you actually have the link to the Understanding Biodiversity report, so please download your copy now. And if you have any question or feedback, email us at hello@positiveluxury.com. We want to hear from you. We'll be back in November with a new webinar about COP26. And until then, please take care and stay safe. Bye.